I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The snow that began falling at tea time on Christmas Eve 1938 transformed the countryside around Starling Hall into a pristine tableau of English winter perfection. By evening, the ancient manor house stood like a jewel set in white velvet, its mullioned windows casting warm golden rectangles across the unmarked drifts. Inside, the great hall glowed with the warmth of a roaring fire and the soft gleam of candlelight reflecting off polished silver and crystal. Lady Aurelia Montfort presided over her annual Christmas Eve gathering with the quiet authority of one born to command. Though age had diminished her physical stature, her presence remained formidable, enhanced this evening by the magnificent brooch adorning her black silk gown. The crimson Christmas star, as she called it, was no mere ornament, but a genuine ruby of extraordinary size and clarity, cut in the shape of a five-pointed star and surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the firelight like captured flames. "Captain Hastings," she said as I bent over her hand in greeting, "you honor us with your presence. I trust the roads were not too treacherous." "Not at all, Lady Aurelia, though I confess the snow seems determined to keep us all here for Christmas." Her laugh was melodious, but carried an undertone I couldn't quite identify. How fitting. Nothing should disturb a proper English Christmas, should it? The assembled company represented the sort of carefully curated guest list that only the English aristocracy could achieve. There was Basil Montfort, Lady Aurelia's nephew and heir presumptive, a man of 35 whose handsome features couldn't quite mask a certain dissolute charm. His sister Claire, quiet and observant, possessed the kind of understated beauty that spoke of good breeding rather than vanity. Dr. Frederick Latham, the family physician, hovered near Lady Aurelia with the protective concern of one who had served the family for decades. Lionel Quarles, the renowned Bond Street jeweler, had arrived that afternoon with his portable display case and 2 assistants. A man of precise habits and calculating eyes, he had been engaged to provide both expertise and security for the evening's centerpiece, a formal display of the crimson Christmas star for the guests' admiration. "The piece is quite remarkable," Quarles explained to the assembled company as he prepared his exhibition. 17th century, possibly Mughal in origin, though the setting is clearly European. The central ruby alone is worth more than most country estates. Miss Isabel Vane, the celebrated actress whose recent West End triumph had made her the toast of London, studied the jewel with professional appreciation. "It's like wearing a piece of captured fire," she murmured, her trained voice carrying perfectly across the room. Sir Ralph Darnley, a financier whose wealth rivaled that of his hostess, nodded approvingly. "Sound investment, Lady Aurelia. Gems hold their value better than most securities in these uncertain times." The Reverend Chichester, a scholarly man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, offered a different perspective. "Beautiful things often carry beautiful curses in legend. I trust this star brings only joy to its owner." As the evening progressed toward the appointed hour of 10 o'clock, when Quarles would formally display the star in his specially designed case, I noticed the subtle tensions that seemed to thread through the gathering like invisible wires. Basil's charm carried an edge of desperation when he spoke to his aunt. Claire watched her mother with barely concealed anxiety. Dr. Latham's professional concern seemed heightened beyond what Lady Aurelia's generally robust health would warrant. The ceremony itself was conducted with appropriate gravity. Quarles had positioned his display case, a masterwork of crystal and chrome, on a pedestal near the magnificent Christmas tree. The case could be sealed with a glass bell and secured with both a mechanical lock and a wax seal bearing Lady Aurelia's personal crest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Quarles announced, "for your peace of mind and the security of this priceless artifact, I shall demonstrate our precautions." Lady Aurelia removed the brooch with obvious reluctance, her fingers lingering on the warm metal before placing it on the velvet cushion within the case. Quarles lowered the glass bell with ceremonial precision, then produced a length of crimson silk ribbon. "The ribbon is tied around the base," he explained, suiting action to words, "and sealed with wax bearing Lady Aurelia's crest. Any tampering will be immediately apparent." The warm wax received the impression of Lady Aurelia's signet ring, a bird in flight, leaving a perfect seal. The assembled guests murmured their appreciation for such thoroughness. It was at that precise moment that the lights failed. The transition from warm electric illumination to absolute darkness was so sudden and complete that it seemed almost supernatural. There were startled exclamations, the sound of someone rising quickly from a chair, and the distinct chime of crystal touching crystal. In the darkness, I detected the faint scent of violets and the rustle of silk. "Nobody move," Quarles commanded sharply. "Crispin, candles, quickly!" The butler's voice came from near the doorway, unruffled despite the circumstances. "At once, sir. Mrs. Dudgeon has the matches." Lady Aurelia's voice cut through the confusion with calm authority. Everyone remained still. "Claire, take my hand." "I'm here, Mama," came the immediate reply, tinged with relief. The first candle flame bloomed like a flower in the darkness, followed quickly by others, as light gradually returned to the great hall, revealing familiar faces touched with concern and confusion. Quarles moved immediately to his display case. The crimson ribbon remained intact. The wax seal bore no sign of tampering, the impression of the bird as clear and perfect as when it had been made moments before. Yet when Quarles lifted the glass bell with trembling hands, the velvet cushion lay empty. The crimson Christmas star had vanished without a trace. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft hiss of falling snow against the windows and the distant ticking of the hall clock. Lady Aurelia did not cry out or faint. Such dramatics were beneath her dignity. Instead, she studied the empty case with the same calm attention she might give to an interesting chess problem. "How very curious," she said at last. "Mr. Quarles, are you quite certain your precautions were adequate?" The jeweler's face had gone ashen. "Lady Aurelia, I stake my reputation, my life, on the security of that seal. It cannot have been opened and resealed in darkness, not in mere moments." Yet the evidence was undeniable. The star was gone, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. And with the snow now falling in earnest, sealing the manor house from the outside world, the thief was certainly still among us. It was then that I remembered the telegram I dispatched earlier that day, sent on an impulse I couldn't quite explain. If anyone could unravel this impossible puzzle, it would be my friend Hercule Poirot. I could only hope the morning train would bring him through the snow to Starling Hall, for we would surely need his little grey cells to solve the mystery of the crimson Christmas star. The game, as Poirot would say, had begun. The moments following the discovery stretched like taut wire, each person in the great hall suspended between disbelief and the dawning realization that they were trapped with a thief. Lady Aurelia broke the silence with characteristic authority, her voice cutting through the murmurs of confusion like a blade through silk. "Crispin," she commanded, "secure all entrances immediately. No one is to leave this house until this matter is resolved." The butler moved with practiced efficiency, his footsteps echoing hollowly as he departed to carry out her instructions. The sound of heavy bolts sliding home punctuated his return, each metallic click a reminder of their collective imprisonment. Sir Ralph Darnley had positioned himself near the fireplace, his financier's mind already calculating probabilities. "The practical matter," he announced, "is that we have a thief among us. The romantic notion of outside interference is eliminated by the weather itself." He gestured toward the tall windows, where snow continued to accumulate against the glass in pristine drifts. "No one has entered or left this house since the storm began." Dr. Latham approached the display case with the methodical care of his profession, his experienced eyes noting details that others might miss. "The seal appears absolutely intact," he murmured, bending closer to examine Quarl's handiwork. Yet the impression in the velvet shows clearly where the star rested. Most curious. I found myself drawn to study the faces around me, each person's reaction telling its own story. Basil Montfort paced with barely contained agitation, his usual charm replaced by something approaching desperation. His sister Claire remained near their aunt, but her pale complexion and the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her shawl suggested an inner turmoil that her composed exterior could not entirely conceal. Miss Isabel Vane stood apart from the others, her actress's training evident in the way she held herself. Perfectly poised, yet somehow separate from the drama unfolding around her. The Reverend Chichester had retreated to a chair near the Christmas tree, his scholarly features creased with concern as he watched the proceedings with the detached interest of one accustomed to observing human nature in all its complexities. Quarles continued his frantic examination of the display case, his reputation hanging in the balance with each passing moment. "I stake my professional standing on the impossibility of what has occurred," he declared, his voice strained with emotion. "This seal cannot have been broken and reformed. The wax shows no sign of heating, no fingerprints, no tool marks. It is as perfect as when Lady Aurelia impressed it with her ring." Yet as I moved closer to examine the case myself, certain details began to emerge that had escaped notice in the initial shock of discovery. On the carpet beside the pedestal lay a tiny fragment of crimson wax, no larger than a pinhead, easily overlooked in the confusion. The ribbon around the case's base, while appearing intact, showed a single fiber standing slightly proud of the weave at the back, where it would be hidden from casual observation. Most intriguing of all was a faint but unmistakable scent that lingered near the display case. The delicate fragrance of violets, subtle yet distinctive. I glanced around the assembled company, noting that Miss Vane wore just such a perfume, though whether this observation held significance remained to be determined. "The question before us," Lady Aurelia said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "is not whether the theft occurred, that much is evident, but how it was accomplished and by whom. We are, all of us, under suspicion until this mystery is resolved." The implications of her words settled over the gathering like a shroud. Each person was now both investigator and suspect, watcher and watched. Basil's pacing grew more pronounced, while Claire seemed to shrink further into herself. Sir Ralph's calculating gaze moved from face to face, as if mentally cataloguing evidence and alibis. It was then that I remembered my telegram to Poirot with a surge of hope that felt almost like salvation. "Actually," I ventured, drawing the attention of the entire company, "I may have anticipated our need for expert assistance. I took the liberty of wiring Hercule Poirot this afternoon, informing him of my plans to spend Christmas at Starling Hall." The effect of this announcement was immediate and revealing. Lady Aurelia's face brightened with genuine relief, while Dr. Latham nodded approvingly. Quarles looked as though he had been thrown a lifeline, his desperate expression giving way to something approaching hope. Others, however, showed markedly different reactions. Basil's face darkened, and he ceased his pacing abruptly. Miss Vane's composure slipped for just an instant, revealing something that might have been alarm. Even the Reverend Chichester seemed troubled by the prospect of Poirot's involvement. "Monsieur Poirot's reputation precedes him," Lady Aurelia said with satisfaction. "If anyone can unravel this impossible puzzle, surely it is he. Captain Hastings, you continue to prove your worth as both guest and friend." Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, sealing us within the manor house as effectively as any prison. The crimson Christmas star had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that before this Christmas was over, one among us would be revealed as a thief, and perhaps something worse. The stage was set, the players assembled, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the snow-covered windows, I could only hope that Hercule Poirot was even now making his way towards Starling Hall, drawn by that mysterious instinct that so often brought him to where his talents were most desperately needed. The immediate aftermath of the theft saw Lady Aurelia assert her authority with the calm precision of a general organizing a battlefield. "Crispin," she commanded, "see that all entrances remain secured, and post Thomas at the main door. No one enters or leaves without my express permission." The butler's acknowledgment was swift and professional, but I noticed the slight tremor in his usually steady hands as he departed to carry out her instructions. The company arranged itself around the great hall with the awkward formality of people suddenly aware they were both investigators and suspects. Lady Aurelia directed the reconstruction of positions with methodical care, each person indicating where they had stood when the lights failed. Quarles remained near his violated display case, his professional pride wounded as deeply as if he had been physically struck. His assistants, Allen and Pope, flanked him like mourners at a funeral, their usual efficiency replaced by bewildered helplessness. "The electrical failure," Dr. Latham observed, his medical training lending analytical weight to his words, "was most convenient in its timing. Crispin, you mentioned the fuse had blown before?" The butler confirmed that winter storms frequently caused such problems, producing the thin wire coil as evidence. Yet as I studied the faces around me, I noticed how this explanation satisfied no one entirely. The coincidence felt too perfect, too precisely timed to the moment of the star's display. As we reconstructed the scene, certain details emerged that had been overlooked in the initial shock. The faint scent of violets lingered near the display case, subtle but unmistakable. Miss Isabel Vane wore such a perfume, though whether this observation held significance remained unclear. More intriguing was the tiny fragment of crimson wax I had noticed earlier, barely visible on the carpet beside the pedestal, and a single thread that stood proud from the silk ribbon's weave at the back of the case. Lady Aurelia would permit no undignified searches that evening. "We are civilized people," she declared with finality, "and we shall conduct ourselves accordingly. The truth will emerge through proper investigation, not through the crude expedient of treating our guests as common criminals." Her words carried the weight of absolute authority, yet I sensed the strain beneath her composed exterior. The night that followed was one of the longest I had ever experienced. Sleep proved elusive for most of the household, as evidenced by the soft footsteps that echoed through the corridors at irregular intervals and the murmur of hushed conversations behind closed doors. I found myself walking the halls, unable to rest, my mind turning over the impossible puzzle of the vanished star. Basil Montfort had retreated to the library, ostensibly to attend to correspondence, but the nervous energy emanating from behind the closed doors suggested anything but peaceful letter-writing. His sister Claire remained close to Lady Aurelia, her pale complexion and worried glances speaking of inner turmoil that her composed demeanor could not entirely conceal. Sir Ralph Darnley had taken to making lists, his financier's mind attempting to impose order on the chaos through systematic documentation of facts and observations. The Reverend Chichester spent much of the night in the chapel, whether seeking divine guidance or merely solitude I could not determine. Miss Vane maintained her theatrical poise, but I noticed how her eyes followed each person's movements with the calculating attention of one accustomed to studying human nature for professional purposes. Dr. Latham made his rounds with increased frequency, checking on Lady Aurelia's health with the protective concern of one who had served the family for decades. Quarles never left the great hall, maintaining his vigil beside the empty display case like a sentry who had failed in his duty and sought redemption through continued watchfulness. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the snow had intensified during the night, transforming the landscape into an unbroken expanse of white that effectively sealed us within the manor's walls. The world beyond seemed to have ceased to exist, leaving us isolated with our suspicions and fears. Breakfast was a strained affair, each person maintaining the facade of civilized behavior while tension crackled beneath the surface like electricity before a thunderstorm. Conversations were stilted, punctuated by meaningful glances and carefully chosen words. The usual Christmas morning cheer was notably absent, replaced by an atmosphere of barely controlled anxiety. It was nearly noon when the distinctive sound of an automobile engine cut through the winter silence. The mechanical purr grew steadily louder as it navigated the snow-covered drive, finally stopping directly outside the main entrance. Lady Aurelia's face brightened with unmistakable relief as heavy car doors slammed and muffled voices could be heard speaking in rapid consultation. Crispin appeared with unusual haste, his typically unflappable demeanor betraying a hint of anticipation. Before he could reach the entrance, however, the heavy door swung open to admit a figure who, despite the arduous journey through the blizzard, appeared utterly immaculate. Hercule Poirot stepped into the warm glow of the entrance hall, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his suit uncreased, his famous mustache waxed to perfection. "Hastings, mon ami," he said warmly, removing his gloves with characteristic precision. "Your telegram was most intriguing. I confess I did not expect to find such dramatic circumstances awaiting our arrival." His sharp green eyes had already begun their methodical survey of the great hall, taking in the assembled guests, the violated display case, and the general atmosphere of barely controlled tension. Lady Aurelia rose with regal dignity, extending her hand with the grace of one accustomed to receiving distinguished guests under any circumstances. "Monsieur Poirot, your reputation precedes you. I fear the circumstances of our meeting are rather more dramatic than one might wish for a Christmas gathering. We have experienced what can only be described as an impossible theft." Poirot's eyes brightened with unmistakable professional interest. "Ah, Lady Aurelia, you honor me greatly. An impossible theft, you say. But Poirot, he does not believe in impossibilities, only in facts that have not yet arranged themselves in their proper order." He moved with small, precise steps toward the display case, his hands clasped behind his back as he began his preliminary examination. The jeweler Quarles stepped forward eagerly, desperation evident in every gesture. "Monsieur Poirot, I stake my professional reputation on the integrity of that seal. It cannot have been tampered with, yet the star has vanished completely. My standing, my very livelihood, depends upon your proving that no fault lies with my security measures." "Patience, Monsieur Quarles," Poirot murmured, his attention focused entirely on the empty case. He did not touch anything, but his eyes moved with systematic thoroughness, cataloguing every detail. "The facts, they will speak when they are ready. But first, perhaps Captain Hastings could provide the sequence of events as they occurred." As I recounted the previous evening's progression from the formal display through the mysterious electrical failure to the discovery of the theft, Poirot listened without interruption, his head tilted slightly in the attitude I recognized as complete absorption. Occasionally his gaze would flick to one or another of the assembled company, as though filing away their reactions for future reference. When I finished, Poirot remained silent for several moments, his eyes closed in concentration. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Finally, he opened his eyes and favored the company with one of his enigmatic smiles. "Most interesting," he said at last. "But now, mes amis, the real work begins." For Poirot, he sees certain details that perhaps have escaped the notice of others. And these details, they will lead us to the truth that hides behind this seemingly impossible crime. The game, as I well knew, was now truly afoot. Poirot's examination of the display case was conducted with the methodical precision of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. He circled the pedestal with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back, his green eyes cataloguing every detail with systematic thoroughness. The assembled company watched in fascination as he bent to study the tiny fragment of crimson wax I had noticed earlier, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. "Très intéressant," he murmured, straightening with obvious satisfaction. "Captain Hastings, your powers of observation do you credit. This small fragment, it tells us much about the nature of our mystery." He moved to examine the silk ribbon around the case's base, where that single thread stood proud of the weave. Using the corner of an envelope as a delicate tool, he carefully nudged the wax fragment onto the paper without disturbing its position. The faint scent of violets lingered near the display case, subtle yet unmistakable. Poirot's gaze traveled toward Miss Isabel Vane with polite interest, though he made no comment about her perfume. Instead, he requested Lady Aurelia's signet ring, studying the impression in the wax seal with intense concentration. "A bird in flight," he observed quietly. "Most graceful. And this seal, Lady Aurelia, it shows no signs of tampering, yet the star has vanished. An impossibility, you might say. But Poirot does not believe in impossibilities, only in facts that have not yet arranged themselves in their proper order." Quarles stepped forward eagerly, desperation evident in every gesture. "Monsieur Poirot, I stake my professional reputation on the integrity of that seal. My security measures were absolutely sound, yet somehow the impossible has occurred. My very livelihood depends upon your proving that no fault lies with my methods." "Patience, Monsieur Quarles," Poirot replied with gentle authority. "The facts, they will speak when they are ready. But first, I must understand not merely what happened, but why it happened. The human heart, it is more complex than any mechanical lock." He requested the use of Lady Aurelia's private drawing room for confidential interviews, explaining that truth often emerged more readily in intimate surroundings. The smaller chamber, adorned with family portraits and personal mementos, provided the perfect setting for psychological exploration. "Lady Aurelia," Poirot began once we were seated, his voice carrying that particular gentleness he reserved for those bearing genuine grief, "this star holds great sentimental value for you, I apprehend." Her composure remained intact, but I detected the slight tremor in her voice as she replied, "It was a gift from my late husband on our 40th anniversary, Monsieur Poirot. Beyond its considerable monetary worth, it represents memories that cannot be replaced. And its monetary worth, it is indeed considerable. More than most country estates, as Sir Ralph so accurately observed. Certainly enough to tempt those facing financial difficulties." Her words carried a weight that suggested specific knowledge rather than general observation. Poirot's eyes sharpened with professional interest. "You speak as one who has encountered such temptation before, perhaps?" Lady Aurelia's gaze drifted to a portrait above the fireplace, her expression growing troubled. "My nephew Basil is my heir presumptive, Monsieur Poirot. A charming young man, but one who has always lived beyond his means. His debts have become increasingly pressing of late." "Ah," Poirot murmured, his fingers steepled before him, "and these debts, they are of a nature that might drive a desperate man to extraordinary measures." "I pray not," she replied, though her tone suggested her prayers might be in vain. "Basil has borrowed against his expectations repeatedly. His creditors have grown impatient, and certain gambling debts carry consequences beyond mere financial embarrassment." This revelation cast an entirely new light on the previous evening's events. Basil's nervous energy, his desperate charm, the way his face had darkened at the mention of Poirot's involvement, all these details now arranged themselves into a pattern of guilty knowledge. "You have been most helpful, Lady Aurelia," Poirot said, rising with a courteous bow. "Now, with your permission, I should like to speak with your nephew. Sometimes the younger generation reveals truths that age and wisdom prefer to conceal." As we returned to the great hall, I noticed how the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Poirot's methodical approach had already begun peeling back the layers of polite society, revealing the anxieties and hidden currents beneath. The violated display case stood like an accusation in the center of the room, its empty velvet cushion a constant reminder that somewhere among these civilized people lurked a thief whose desperation had driven them to attempt the impossible. The game was indeed afoot, and I sensed that Poirot's famous little grey cells were already beginning to arrange the facts in their proper order. The truth would emerge, as it always did, through patient observation and the careful understanding of human nature in all its complexity. Basil Montfort entered the drawing-room with the studied casualness of a man attempting to project innocence while battling profound inner turmoil. His handsome features bore the unmistakable signs of a sleepless night, and despite his careful grooming, something disheveled about his appearance spoke of anxiety that no amount of pomade could conceal. He settled into the chair opposite Poirot with affected nonchalance, crossing his legs and producing his cigarette case with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, his practiced charm carrying an edge of desperation, "I confess this whole business seems quite beyond rational explanation. Poor Quarles looks positively haunted by the impossibility of it all." Poirot observed him with the patient attention of a physician studying symptoms. "Indeed, Monsieur Basil, the impossible has a way of troubling the mind. But tell me, when the lights failed last evening, where precisely were you positioned?" "Near the fireplace, I believe." The reply came perhaps a fraction too quickly, as though rehearsed. "Yes, definitely by the mantelpiece. I remember the marble was cold when I reached out instinctively in the darkness." "Ah, by the fireplace. And during those moments of darkness, did you remain stationary?" A barely perceptible hesitation betrayed him. "I may have taken a step or two, purely instinctive, you understand. One tends to seek something solid when suddenly plunged into blackness." His foot began an unconscious tapping against the chair leg, which he stopped with visible effort. Poirot nodded with apparent understanding, though I detected the slight narrowing of his eyes that indicated professional interest. "Quite natural. And your financial circumstances, Monsieur Basil? They are satisfactory at present." The question struck like a physical blow. Basil's carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something approaching panic before he regained control. The cigarette case slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with unnatural loudness. "I beg your pardon. I fail to see how my personal finances relate to this matter." "Perhaps they do not," Poirot replied with deceptive mildness. "But Poirot finds that understanding the pressures upon a person often illuminates their actions. You are, I believe, your aunt's heir presumptive." "That is correct, though I hardly see the relevance. Aunt Aurelia enjoys excellent health." The words rang hollow, delivered with mechanical politeness rather than genuine feeling. "Of course. Yet inheritance can be a burden as well as a blessing, no? Particularly when creditors grow impatient and expect payment based upon future expectations rather than present resources." Basil's face had grown pale, and his hands now gripped the chair arms with white-knuckled intensity. A fine sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. "Monsieur Poirot, I must protest. These questions seem highly inappropriate." "Forgive me," Poirot said with that peculiar gentleness he employed when closing in on uncomfortable truths. "But you see, the theft of the Crimson Christmas star was not a crime of opportunity, but one of desperation. Someone in this house faces pressures so severe that they were willing to attempt the seemingly impossible." The silence stretched like a taut wire. When Basil finally spoke, his voice carried barely controlled desperation. "Very well. My circumstances are indeed strained. Certain gambling debts have accumulated, and the parties involved are not known for their patience or gentle collection methods. A telegram arrived yesterday afternoon advising that unless certain sums were forthcoming within the week, some unpleasantness would follow." "You showed this telegram to no one?" "No one. I burned it immediately." His laugh was bitter. "The unpleasantness has arrived in a different form than I expected." And the electrical system in this house, Monsieur Basil. You are familiar with its peculiarities? The change of subject seemed to catch him off guard. Very little, I'm afraid. Crispin handles such matters, though I know winter storms frequently cause problems with the fuses. Ah, yes. The convenient failure of the lights. Most fortuitous timing, was it not? Poirot's tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the silk. Tell me, when did you last visit the cellar? Basil buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. You don't understand the pressures I face, Monsieur Poirot. These men don't make idle threats. The amount they demand might as well be the crown jewels. But the crimson Christmas star would be sufficient to satisfy these debts. A long pause filled only with the soft crackling of the fire. Finally, Basil nodded, the gesture carrying absolute defeat. More than sufficient. It would solve everything. When Basil departed, his shoulders squared as if leaving court after harsh cross-examination, the atmosphere in the great hall had shifted palpably. Whispers followed him, and meaningful glances were exchanged. Sir Ralph Darnley nodded knowingly, while even Dr. Latham regarded the young man with troubled concern. It seems quite clear, Poirot, I remarked, feeling satisfaction that the culprit had been so swiftly identified. His debts, his evasiveness, his obvious guilt. Surely the case is solved. Poirot, however, merely stroked his moustache, a faint frown creasing his brow. Ah, Hastings, mon ami, you are too quick to embrace the obvious conclusion. The pattern is almost too neat, is it not? A man in debt, a valuable jewel, a convenient blackout. It satisfies the casual observer, but leaves too many jagged edges for the connoisseur of crime. He examined the tiny fragment of crimson wax, turning it thoughtfully in his palm. This little piece speaks volumes, as does the single thread from the ribbon. No, Hastings, we have found our first false lead, but the principal actor may yet surprise us. His eyes scanned the assembled company with renewed interest, lingering momentarily on Miss Vane, then Claire Montfort, before resting on the Reverend Chichester. The air of certainty that had begun to settle over the hall was immediately dispelled by Poirot's quiet dissent. The case, far from being solved, had only begun to reveal its true complexities. One layer of deception had been peeled back, but many more, Poirot's expression suggested, remained to be discovered. Poirot's dismissal of the obvious solution sent ripples of uncertainty through the assembled company, replacing the momentary sense of resolution with renewed anxiety. His methodical examination of the violated display case resumed with even greater intensity, the tiny fragment of crimson wax receiving particular attention as he studied it through his magnifying glass. "Most illuminating," he murmured, carefully preserving the fragment in his envelope. "This little piece, it speaks of haste, of pressure applied too quickly to molten wax. Not the careful work of a professional like Monsieur Quarles, but the desperate action of one working against time in darkness." The implications were staggering, yet the sealed case remained an insurmountable puzzle. Poirot requested that Crispin escort us to examine the electrical panel, his interest in the convenient power failure having been piqued by the morning's revelations. In the cellar, amid the scent of coal and a damp stone, he discovered minute scratches on the fuse housing that spoke of deliberate tampering rather than natural failure. "Someone prepared this theft with considerable forethought," he observed, pointing to the fresh tool marks. The darkness was not fortuitous but calculated, timed to the precise moment when all attention focused upon the display. Returning to the great hall, Poirot requested a private interview with Miss Isabel Vane, whose violet perfume had lingered so distinctively near the scene of the crime. She entered the drawing-room with the practiced grace of one accustomed to commanding attention, settling into her chair with theatrical elegance. "Mademoiselle Vane," Poirot began with courteous formality, "your profession requires keen observation of human nature. Perhaps you noticed details that escaped others during last evening's confusion." Her smile was perfectly calibrated, neither too eager nor too dismissive. One learns to watch faces, Monsieur Poirot, even in darkness. There were gasps, certainly, and the sound of someone moving near the Christmas tree. I heard crystal chime softly, as though an ornament had been disturbed. And your own position during the blackout? I remained quite still near the piano. Years on stage teach one to hold position regardless of circumstances. Her confidence was absolute, yet something in her manner suggested layers of complexity beneath the polished performance. Poirot's next question carried deceptive casualness. Your recent theatrical triumph has been most successful, I understand. The financial rewards must be considerable. A shadow crossed her features, fleeting but unmistakable. The theatre is a fickle mistress, Monsieur Poirot. Today's triumph becomes tomorrow's memory, and one must always prepare for the next production. Resources are often stretched thin between engagements. Indeed, and the Crimson Christmas Star, such a piece might provide considerable security for an uncertain future. Miss Vane's composure remained intact, but her knuckles whitened slightly as her hands tightened in her lap. Are you suggesting I would jeopardize my reputation for mere monetary gain? My standing in the theatre is everything to me. Poirot suggests nothing, he replied mildly. Poirot merely observes that desperation takes many forms, and even the most respectable facades can conceal pressing necessities. When Miss Vane departed, her violet perfume lingering like an accusation, Poirot summoned the Reverend Chichester. The scholarly clergyman entered with obvious reluctance, his usual gentle demeanor strained by the morning's events. Reverend, Poirot began without preamble. Several witnesses have noted that your hands bore traces of something dark following last evening's excitement. Perhaps you could explain this circumstance. The clergyman's face flushed deeply as he examined his fingers with embarrassment. I fear the explanation is quite mundane, Monsieur Poirot. When the lights failed, I instinctively reached for support and unfortunately grasped the fireplace poker, which retained coal dust from the morning's fire tending. Nothing more sinister than clumsiness in darkness. His explanation was delivered with the slight hesitation of one who had prepared his response carefully. Poirot's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, detecting the subtle signs of concealment that years of experience had taught him to recognize. And during those moments of darkness, you remained in your original position. I believe so, though complete disorientation makes certainty impossible. I may have taken a step or two seeking stability. Again, that telltale pause that suggested more knowledge than was being revealed. As the Reverend departed, Claire Montfort approached with hesitant determination. Monsieur Poirot, she said quietly, I must speak regarding my brother. There are circumstances you should understand that might explain his behavior without condemning his character. In private conversation, Claire's fierce loyalty emerged with touching intensity. Basil may be foolish with money, but he would never steal from Aunt Aurelia. She has been more than generous since our parents died. Yesterday evening, just before the lights failed, I overheard him speaking with someone in the corridor saying he had found another solution to his difficulties. This revelation cast Basil's obvious guilt in an entirely different light. If he had indeed discovered an alternative to theft, what explained his desperate demeanor when questioned? Yet his knowledge of the house's electrical system, gained through years of residence, remained troubling. This conversation? Poirot pressed gently. You are certain it was your brother? Absolutely certain. I know his voice as well as my own. Claire hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. Earlier that day, I saw him coming from the cellar direction, his hands dirty as though he had been working with machinery. The afternoon's interviews had deepened rather than resolved the mystery. Each suspect possessed both motive and opportunity, yet the impossible nature of the theft remained unexplained. The sealed display case continued to mock all attempts at rational analysis, while the Crimson Christmas Star remained as thoroughly vanished as if it had never existed. As the winter light faded beyond the snow-covered windows, Poirot stood before the violated case in thoughtful contemplation. "The psychological game has begun in earnest, Hastings," he murmured. "We have applied pressure and observed reactions. Some crumble under direct assault, others deflect with practiced skill, while still others reveal truths they did not intend to share." His gaze swept the assembled company, noting how each person's facade had begun to crack under the relentless pressure of investigation. The truth was emerging, layer by careful layer, though its final form remained hidden in the shadows of deception and misdirection. The little grey cells were indeed arranging the facts in their proper order, and I sensed that before this Christmas was over, the careful balance of secrets and lies would shift dramatically, revealing truths that would surprise us all. As evening descended upon Starling Hall, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged with unspoken accusations and barely contained anxiety. Poirot observed the company during dinner with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens, noting how each person's carefully maintained facade had begun to show hairline cracks under the mounting pressure of investigation. The violated display case remained in the great hall like a constant accusation, its empty velvet cushion visible through the doorway as a reminder that somewhere among these refined people sat a thief whose desperation had driven them to attempt the impossible. Dr. Latham approached Poirot during the brief interval before coffee was served, his medical training evident in the methodical way he presented his concerns. "Monsieur Poirot, I feel compelled to share certain professional observations. Lady Aurelia has been under considerable strain recently, though she conceals it admirably. Her heart condition has worsened over recent months, and the shock of this theft could prove genuinely dangerous to her well-being." "You speak as one who has observed specific symptoms, Doctor." "Indeed. The combination of family pressures and now these suspicions falling upon her nephew may prove more devastating than she admits." His concern appeared genuine, yet Poirot detected something held in reserve, some additional knowledge that medical discretion prevented him from sharing fully. Following dinner, Poirot requested another private word with Crispin in the drawing-room. The butler entered with his usual professional composure, though subtle signs of strain had begun to show around his eyes after the day's extraordinary events. "Crispin," Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular gentleness that often preceded uncomfortable revelations. "You mentioned this morning that electrical failures are common during winter storms. The fuse box in the cellar, it is easily accessible to those familiar with the house." A barely perceptible hesitation crossed the butler's features. "The fuse box is located near the wine racks, Monsieur Poirot. Not a place guests would ordinarily venture, but certainly accessible to family members or staff who understand the house's workings. And among the family, who possesses such practical knowledge? Master Basil showed considerable interest in mechanical matters as a boy, always tinkering with various devices. Miss Clare also has a practical turn of mind, often assisting with minor household repairs when needed." Crispin's responses were precise but carefully measured, revealing only what was directly requested. When Crispin departed, Poirot turned to me with that expression I recognized as profound concentration. "The convenient electrical failure grows more interesting, Hastings. Someone possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to create that darkness at precisely the crucial moment." It was then that Crispin returned with obvious distress, his usual unflappable demeanor completely shattered. "Monsieur Poirot," he announced with barely controlled agitation, "there has been a most disturbing development. The blown fuse from this morning, the one I showed you as evidence of the electrical failure, has disappeared from the cellar. The implications struck like a physical blow. The original theft had been audacious enough, but the disappearance of the fuse suggested something far more sinister. Someone was actively attempting to erase all traces of their method, displaying a level of cunning and desperation that sent a collective chill through the assembled company. "This changes everything," Poirot observed quietly, his green eyes bright with professional interest. The removal of the fuse is not merely destruction of evidence, but an act of self-preservation by our culprit. Someone grows nervous, begins making the mistakes that will ultimately betray them. The news spread through the house like wildfire, and I noticed how each person processed this development differently. Basil's relief at potentially being exonerated was replaced by renewed anxiety as the mystery deepened. Miss Vane's theatrical composure showed new cracks, while Sir Ralph's calculating mind seemed to be recalculating probabilities with mechanical precision. As the company gathered in the great hall, Poirot announced his intention to conduct a reconstruction of the previous evening's events. Not as spectacle, he explained with characteristic precision, but as a mirror in which truth might accidentally reveal itself. Lady Aurelia agreed immediately, her authority cutting through any potential objections. If we must endure another darkness, let it be for the sake of illumination. Each person took their position as they had stood during the original display. Quarles remained by his violated case, his professional pride still wounded. Miss Vane positioned herself near the piano, Dr. Latham within protective reach of Lady Aurelia's chair, while the Reverend Chichester stood by the Christmas tree with his hands folded as though in prayer. "Complete darkness for 10 seconds, Poirot announced, then immediate restoration of light. No one must move during this interval. Crispin extinguished the lights at Poirot's signal, plunging us once again into absolute blackness. In that charged silence, every sense became heightened. I detected the whisper of silk nearby, the faint chime of crystal as though a tree branch had been disturbed, and from somewhere near the display case came a soft metallic sound like a pin touching glass, followed by a quickly stifled intake of breath. When the lights blazed back to life, Poirot moved immediately to the pedestal with small, decisive steps. On the carpet lay a slender object that had not been there before, while on the polished chrome rim of the case appeared a faint smear, as if something warm had touched and been hastily removed. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, his satisfaction evident. "Our thief grows increasingly desperate, attempting moves in darkness that reveal more than they conceal." The psychological pressure had achieved its intended effect. Someone in that room was cracking under the relentless scrutiny, making increasingly bold attempts to cover their tracks. Yet each desperate move only served to tighten the net of evidence around them. As we prepared to retire for what promised to be another sleepless night, the atmosphere in Starling Hall had grown almost unbearably tense. The disappearance of the fuse had transformed a baffling theft into something approaching psychological warfare, with Poirot methodically applying pressure until the truth could no longer remain hidden. The little grey cells were indeed arranging the facts in their proper order, and I sensed that tomorrow would bring either confession or catastrophe. The delicate balance of deception and misdirection that had sustained our criminal thus far was beginning to collapse under the weight of mounting evidence and psychological strain. The game had entered its most dangerous phase, where desperation breeds the kind of carelessness that ultimately reveals all secrets. The slender object that had appeared during the reconstruction proved to be a needle of extraordinary craftsmanship, its steel surface bearing the telltale marks of specialized use. Poirot examined it with intense concentration, noting its unusual flexibility and the microscopic traces of a waxy residue that clung to its tip like evidence of recent employment. "Most illuminating," he murmured, producing his magnifying glass to study both the needle and the faint smear that marked the chrome rim of the display case. "This instrument speaks of precision, of delicate work performed under the most challenging circumstances." The implications struck the assembled company with varying degrees of comprehension. Quarles stepped forward with obvious bewilderment, his professional pride once again under scrutiny. "Monsieur Poirot, I can assure you that neither I nor my assistants employ such tools. Our work requires different instruments entirely." Yet as Poirot continued his examination, a pattern began to emerge that suggested far more sophistication than simple theft. The needle bore microscopic traces of crimson wax, while the smear on the display case revealed similar composition under his careful analysis. Most tellingly, both substances retained the faint warmth that spoke of recent manipulation. "The method begins to reveal itself," Poirot announced with quiet satisfaction. "Our thief did not break the seal, mes amis. Such crudity would have been immediately apparent. Instead, they employed a technique of extraordinary delicacy, using precise application of controlled heat to soften the wax without disturbing the impression of Lady Aurelia's crest." Dr. Latham approached with professional curiosity, his medical training lending analytical precision to his observations. "The concept is theoretically sound," he admitted reluctantly. "Wax, when heated to precisely the correct temperature, becomes malleable while retaining its structural integrity. But the skill required for such work would be considerable." The revelation transformed the theft from an impossible crime into a meticulously planned deception, demanding specialized knowledge and steady nerves. Someone in that elegant room possessed both the technical expertise and the desperate motivation to attempt such an audacious scheme. It was at that moment of dawning comprehension that Crispin appeared with barely controlled urgency, his professional composure completely shattered by extraordinary circumstances. "Monsieur Poirot," he announced with obvious distress, "Lady Aurelia has collapsed in her private chambers. She appears to be in considerable distress and is calling for her signet ring, which seems to have gone missing from her bedside table." The news struck the company like a physical blow. Whatever tensions and suspicions had divided us instantly forgotten in the face of genuine human crisis. Dr. Latham's medical authority took immediate precedence as he hurried toward Lady Aurelia's suite, his professional training evident in every decisive movement. Yet even as we followed in concerned procession, Poirot's sharp eyes noted details that others might miss. The timing of Lady Aurelia's collapse, coinciding so precisely with his revelation of the theft method, suggested either extraordinary coincidence or calculated intervention. More troubling still was the missing signet ring, the very instrument that had created the violated seal. "The psychological pressure achieves its intended effect," Poirot murmured to me as we observed the company's reactions. "Someone grows increasingly desperate, making moves that reveal more than they conceal." In Lady Aurelia's chamber, we found her conscious but clearly shaken, her usual composure replaced by obvious distress. Dr. Latham's examination revealed elevated pulse and blood pressure consistent with severe emotional shock, though her fundamental health remained stable. "My ring," she whispered urgently, her gaze moving frantically around the room. "Someone has taken my ring. Without it, I cannot prove—" Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. The signet ring was not merely jewelry, but the key to authenticating the very seal that had been violated. As Dr. Latham administered a mild sedative to calm her nerves, Poirot conducted a discreet examination of the chamber. On the windowsill lay traces of crimson wax, barely visible but unmistakably fresh. A faint scent of violets lingered near the dressing table, while the carpet beside the bed showed the impression of recent footsteps that did not match Lady Aurelia's slippers. "Someone visited this room after our reconstruction," Poirot observed quietly. "The missing ring suggests our thief requires the authentic seal to complete their deception, perhaps to create a duplicate that would withstand closer scrutiny." The implications were staggering. Not only had someone stolen the Crimson Christmas star through extraordinary technical skill, but they were now actively working to cover their tracks by obtaining the means to create perfect replicas of the violated seal. The crime was evolving from simple theft into something approaching criminal artistry. As Lady Aurelia's condition stabilized under Dr. Latham's care, the atmosphere in Starling Hall grew increasingly oppressive. The revelation of the theft method had eliminated the element of impossibility, replacing it with the more disturbing reality of calculated deception. Someone among us possessed both the technical expertise and the cold-blooded determination to execute such an elaborate scheme. The little grey cells, They arranged the facts in their proper order, Poirot murmured as we prepared to return to the great hall. The method is revealed, the motive becomes clear, and the identity of our culprit draws ever closer to the light. The pure psychological game had entered its most dangerous phase, where desperation bred the kind of carelessness that ultimately exposed all secrets. The missing signet ring represented not just another theft, but a crucial error that would lead inevitably to the complete unraveling of our criminal's carefully constructed deception. The final act was approaching, and I sensed that before this Christmas mystery reached its conclusion, all the carefully hidden truths would be dragged into the unforgiving light of Hercule Poirot's relentless investigation. The aftermath of Lady Aurelia's collapse and the discovery of her missing signet ring sent tremors of renewed anxiety through Starling Hall. As Dr. Latham assured us that her condition had stabilized under his care, Poirot's attention returned to the violated display case with fresh intensity, the specialized needle and traces of manipulated wax taking on new significance in light of these latest developments. It was then that Alan, the younger of Quarles's assistants, approached with obvious reluctance and considerable internal struggle. His usual professional composure had been replaced by the nervous energy of one carrying knowledge that could no longer be suppressed, despite the potential consequences to his employment. "Monsieur Poirot," he began hesitantly, glancing toward his employer with barely concealed anxiety. "There is something I observed during yesterday evening's confusion that I did not initially consider significant, but given recent developments." Quarles stepped forward sharply, his wounded professional pride making him eager for any information that might exonerate his security methods. "Alan, if you possess relevant knowledge, you must share it immediately. My reputation depends upon the complete truth." The young man's hands trembled slightly as he continued. "During the restoration of lighting after the electrical failure, while everyone was calling for candles and moving about in confusion, I heard sounds from the direction of the display case. Not the usual sounds of people seeking stability in darkness, but something more deliberate. A soft metallic scraping, like steel against steel, followed by what might have been the whisper of silk fabric. This revelation struck the assembled company with the force of physical impact. The theft had not been accomplished in the brief moments of absolute darkness, as we had assumed, but during the confused interval when flickering candlelight provided just enough illumination for someone with steady nerves and precise knowledge to complete their audacious work. "Most illuminating," Poirot observed, his green eyes bright with professional satisfaction. "The criminal psychology reveals itself through such details. Our thief required not complete darkness, but controlled confusion, using the restoration of light as camouflage for their final manipulations." Before the full implications of Alan's testimony could be absorbed, Claire Montfort appeared at the entrance to the great hall, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious internal struggle. Her pale complexion and the way her hands shook as she approached suggested the weight of difficult decisions and competing loyalties. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, her voice carrying the strain of painful honesty, "I must speak with you privately. There are family circumstances that may cast yesterday's events in an entirely different light, matters I can no longer keep silent about in good conscience." In the privacy of the drawing room, Claire's fierce loyalty to her brother warred visibly with her commitment to truth. When she finally spoke, her words carried the anguish of one forced to choose between love and justice. "Basil is indeed in desperate financial difficulty," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "but not for the selfish reasons everyone assumes. His gambling debts are real, but they stem from frantic attempts to raise money for a cause he cannot publicly acknowledge without betraying Aunt Aurelia's wishes." Poirot leaned forward with that particular intensity he reserved for crucial revelations. "You speak of hidden motivations, Mademoiselle Claire. Perhaps you would elaborate on these circumstances? Our aunt's heart condition is far more serious than she admits publicly. Dr. Latham has been discreet, but I overheard their consultations. She requires specialized treatment available only in Switzerland, and the costs are enormous, far beyond what her estate can readily provide without liquidating major assets, including the Crimson Christmas star. This revelation transformed our understanding of Basil's behavior completely. His desperate charm, his obvious anxiety, even his knowledge of the house's electrical system, all took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of noble sacrifice rather than simple greed. Basil has been attempting to raise the necessary funds through various means, Claire continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. When legitimate efforts failed, he turned to gambling, hoping against hope that luck would provide what honest work could not. But Monsieur Poirot, I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, he would never steal from Aunt Aurelia herself. As Claire departed, her composure completely shattered by the weight of these revelations, Poirot stood in thoughtful contemplation before the violated display case. The specialized needle, the traces of wax, Alan's testimony about metallic sounds, all these elements were arranging themselves into a pattern that spoke of extraordinary technical sophistication. "Hastings," he said suddenly, his voice carrying that note of triumph I recognized as the moment when the little gray cells achieved perfect clarity. "We have been most cleverly misdirected. The wax seal, the heated needle, the careful manipulation of the crimson ribbon, all elaborate theater designed to focus our attention on one method, while the true crime was accomplished through entirely different means." He moved to the display case with renewed purpose, his magnifying glass trained on details that had previously escaped notice. "Observe, mon ami. Quarles demonstrated both a mechanical lock and a wax seal. But during his theatrical presentation, he focused our attention entirely on the wax, sealing the ribbon with such ceremony that we forgot the primary security measure." The revelation struck like lightning. "You mean the mechanical lock was the real target?" "Precisement. The wax seal was perfect misdirection. While we puzzled over impossible manipulation of heated wax in darkness, our thief was employing this specialized needle not to soften sealing wax, but to pick the mechanical lock with surgical precision. The metallic sounds Alan heard, there were not wax being heated, but steel against steel as the lock mechanism was defeated." The audacity of the deception was breathtaking. The criminal had not merely stolen the Crimson Christmas star, but had orchestrated an entire illusion, planting false clues and encouraging assumptions that led us away from the true method. The wax fragment, the proud thread, even the lingering scent of violets, all were either deliberate misdirection or accidental byproducts of creating the appearance of wax manipulation, while the real work was accomplished through lock-picking expertise. And the missing signet ring represents the final desperate gambit. Poirot continued, his voice growing grim. "Our thief knows I have seen through their elaborate ruse. To sell the star or establish its provenance, they require a truly untampered seal, one that could withstand expert scrutiny. They have taken Lady Aurelia's ring to create perfect replicas, hoping to obscure their tracks permanently." The psychological pressure that had been building throughout our investigation was approaching its breaking point. Someone in that elegant company possessed not only the technical expertise to defeat sophisticated security measures, but the calculating intelligence to construct such an elaborate deception. The crime revealed itself as the work not of desperate amateur, but of someone with profound understanding of both mechanical systems and human psychology. "The time approaches, Hastings," Poirot declared, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of complete understanding, "when all deceptions must be stripped away. The facts have arranged themselves in their proper order, and the truth, like the Crimson Christmas star itself, cannot remain hidden forever." As evening descended upon Starling Hall and the snow continued its relentless siege, sealing us within the manor's walls, I sensed that we stood at the threshold of revelation. The careful balance of secrets and lies that had sustained our criminal thus far was crumbling under the weight of Poirot's relentless investigation. The final gathering was imminent, and with it, the terrifying prospect of truth emerging from the shadows where it had so cunningly concealed itself. The revelation of the truth theft method sent a profound shock through the assembled company, transforming their understanding of the crime from impossible mystery to calculated deception. Yet even as Poirot's explanation of the lock-picking technique illuminated the mechanical aspects of the theft, the identity of the culprit remained tantalizingly beyond reach. It was then that fate, in the form of a seemingly insignificant detail, provided the final piece of evidence that would complete the puzzle. As we stood discussing the implications of the specialized needle and its true purpose, Crispin appeared with obvious urgency, his professional composure strained by yet another extraordinary development. "Monsieur Poirot," he announced with barely controlled excitement, "Lady Aurelia's signet ring has been returned. It was discovered in the chapel, placed discreetly in the collection box." The news struck the company with electric intensity. Someone's nerve had finally broken under the relentless pressure of investigation, compelling them to return the stolen ring before its absence could damn them completely. Yet as Poirot examined the recovered signet with his magnifying glass, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Most illuminating," he murmured, turning the ring carefully in the lamplight. "This ring tells a story of desperate haste and professional knowledge. Observe, Hastings, the microscopic traces of jeweler's rouge in the crevices of the crest and the faint heat discoloration around the band's edges where it has been subjected to controlled warming." The implications struck like lightning. Someone had not merely stolen the ring, but had used it in conjunction with professional jeweling equipment to create duplicate seals, hoping to establish false provenance for the stolen star. The rouge residue spoke of access to specialized polishing compounds, while the heat marks suggested the use of precision instruments found only in a jeweler's workshop. Poirot's gaze moved methodically around the assembled company, his green eyes cataloging reactions with scientific precision. When his attention settled on Quarles and his assistants, the jeweler's face underwent a transformation that spoke volumes about guilt and recognition. "The psychological pressure achieves its intended effect," Poirot observed quietly. "Someone grows increasingly desperate, making moves that reveal more than they conceal. The return of the ring was meant to eliminate evidence, but instead it provides the final confirmation of our culprit's identity." He moved to examine Quarles' portable workshop with renewed interest, his trained eye noting details that had previously escaped attention. The spirit lamp showed recent use despite no legitimate need for such equipment since their arrival. A small quantity of jeweler's rouge was missing from its container, while several precision files bore microscopic traces that matched the markings on Lady Aurelia's recovered ring. "The method becomes perfectly clear," Poirot announced with quiet satisfaction. "Our thief possessed not only the technical expertise to defeat the mechanical lock, but access to the specialized equipment necessary to create convincing duplicate seals. They understood that selling the Crimson Christmas Star would require impeccable provenance, necessitating perfect replicas of Lady Aurelia's authentic seal." The atmosphere in the great hall had grown suffocating with tension. Each person's carefully maintained facade was cracking under the relentless pressure of psychological investigation, revealing the hidden anxieties and guilty knowledge that lay beneath their civilized exteriors. Pope, the elder of Quarles' assistants, had grown increasingly pale throughout the examination, his usual professional composure replaced by barely controlled panic. His hands trembled as he watched Poirot's methodical analysis of the workshop tools, while perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. The lock-picking expertise, the access to jeweling equipment, the knowledge of security procedures, Poirot continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. All point to someone intimately familiar with the protection of valuable artifacts, someone whose professional reputation provided perfect camouflage for criminal intent. As the full implications of the evidence became clear, Lady Aurelia requested that the formal revelation be conducted with appropriate ceremony. "If we must witness the unmasking of a criminal," she declared with characteristic dignity. "Let it be done properly, with all parties present to hear the complete truth." Poirot agreed immediately, recognizing that the psychological impact of a formal gathering would provide the perfect setting for his final exposition. "Very well, Lady Aurelia. Let us assemble at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning for the complete revelation of this most ingenious crime. The facts have arranged themselves in their proper order, and the time has come for all deceptions to be stripped away." As the company began to disperse for what promised to be another sleepless night, the weight of approaching revelation hung over Starling Hall like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. The crimson Christmas star remained as thoroughly vanished as ever, but its thief's identity was no longer hidden in shadow. The psychological game had reached its climax, and tomorrow would bring either confession or the complete exposure of one of the most audacious crimes in Poirot's extensive experience. The little grey cells had indeed arranged all facts in their proper order, and justice, like truth itself, could no longer be denied or delayed. The final act awaited, and with it, the terrifying prospect of absolute revelation in the unforgiving light of Hercule Poirot's relentless logic. The morning of December 26th broke crisp and clear, the snow-covered landscape sparkling under pale winter sunlight that streamed through the tall windows of Starling Hall's great room. The storm had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a pristine world that seemed to mock the dark secrets that had festered within the manor's walls. At precisely 10 o'clock, the assembled company gathered with the solemn formality of a tribunal, each person bearing the weight of sleepless anxiety and the knowledge that before the morning was over, one among them would be revealed as the perpetrator of an audacious crime. Poirot entered with his characteristic precision, his appearance immaculate despite the extraordinary circumstances of the past 2 days. He had arranged the chairs in a semicircle facing the violated display case, creating a theatrical setting that would focus all attention on his methodical revelation of the truth. Lady Aurelia, fully recovered from her collapse, presided with regal dignity from her customary chair, while the others arranged themselves according to some invisible hierarchy of guilt and innocence. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular authority that commanded absolute attention. "We have witnessed what appeared to be an impossible crime. The theft of the crimson Christmas star from a sealed and witnessed container defied rational explanation. Yet Poirot does not believe in impossibilities, only in facts that have not yet arranged themselves in their proper order." He moved to the display case with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back in the attitude I recognized as complete professional concentration. The method, as we discovered through careful analysis, was not the manipulation of heated wax as our criminal intended us to believe, but the precise defeat of the mechanical lock using specialized tools and extraordinary skill. The wax seal remained intact because it was never disturbed, serving merely as magnificent misdirection, while the true work was accomplished through lock-picking expertise of the highest caliber. Quarles shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his professional reputation still hanging in the balance despite the revelation that his security measures had been defeated through technical skill rather than design failure. His assistants, Allen and Pope, flanked him with expressions of growing anxiety as Poirot's exposition continued, though Pope's pallor had become increasingly pronounced. The psychological aspects of this crime reveal themselves through careful observation of human behavior under pressure. Poirot continued, his green eyes moving systematically across the assembled faces. The electrical failure was no accident of winter weather, but a calculated sabotage. The fuse, as we discovered through examination of the cellar, bore the marks of deliberate tampering. Someone with intimate knowledge of this house's systems created that darkness at the precise moment when all attention focused upon the display. He produced the specialized needle that had appeared during our reconstruction, holding it up to catch the morning light. This instrument speaks of professional training, of hands accustomed to the most delicate work with precious materials. Not for heating wax, as the false clues suggested, but for the precise manipulation of mechanical lock tumblers. Allen's testimony about metallic scraping sounds during the restoration of light confirms this method. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Pope's face had grown ashen, while his hands gripped the arms of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. Perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. The missing signet ring represented the final, desperate gambit. Poirot continued relentlessly. Our thief knew that selling the Crimson Christmas Star would require impeccable provenance, necessitating perfect replicas of Lady Aurelia's authentic seal. The jeweler's rouge residue in the ring's crevices, the heat discoloration from controlled warming, these details reveal the use of professional equipment to create convincing duplicates. Pope suddenly lurched to his feet, his composure completely shattered like glass under unbearable pressure. "You don't understand," he cried, his voice breaking with the weight of suppressed anguish. "My wife, she's dying, Monsieur Poirot. The doctors say there's a treatment in Vienna, experimental but promising. The cost—" His voice failed him entirely as tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. The confession struck the assembled company like a thunderbolt. Quarles stared at his trusted assistant with horrified disbelief, while Allen shrank back as though from physical contamination. Lady Aurelia's expression remained composed, but I detected the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of profound shock at this revelation of desperate love twisted into criminal action. "The technique was flawless," Pope continued, his professional pride intact even in defeat. "I studied the house during our preparation, learned the electrical system's vulnerabilities. The blown fuse was prepared in advance, timed to create confusion at the crucial moment. While everyone focused on that theatrical wax seal, I used lock-picking tools refined through 30 years in the jewelry trade. The heated needle was meant to suggest wax manipulation, creating false evidence to misdirect your investigation." Poirot nodded with that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that marked the conclusion of his most challenging cases. The psychological pressure achieved its intended effect. The return of the signet ring, meant to eliminate evidence, instead provided final confirmation through the jeweler's rouge residue and heat marks from your workshop equipment. "Where is the star now?" Lady Aurelia asked with quiet authority, her voice steady despite the betrayal she had witnessed. Pope's shoulders sagged in complete defeat as he gestured toward Quarles's portable workshop. "Hidden where heat would mask heat," he whispered. "In the spirit lamp's false bottom, a cavity I created years ago for transporting particularly valuable pieces. No one questions a warm tool, and the lamp's legitimate use disguised any telltale signs." Poirot moved to the workshop with the precision of a surgeon, his earlier examination having already revealed the lamp's secret. With delicate manipulation of the base's concealed mechanism, he separated the fuel reservoir to reveal a felt-lined cavity. From within, he drew a small wrapped bundle that, when unfolded, revealed the Crimson Christmas Star in all its magnificent glory. The ruby caught the winter light and transformed it into liquid fire, its beauty unmarred by the extraordinary circumstances of its temporary disappearance. Lady Aurelia breathed once, sharply, a sound between pain and profound relief. Claire made a small, involuntary exclamation of wonder, while Basil, whose countenance had carried the strain of a condemned man reprieved, turned away and covered his face with his hands. The hiding place was ingenious, Poirot acknowledged with professional respect. A tool in constant use, its warmth natural and unremarkable. Yet the slight discoloration on the chrome rim of the display case, where heated metal had touched and been hastily withdrawn, provided the crucial clue to your method. As Crispin summoned the local constabulary by telephone, now that the roads were cleared, the extraordinary events of the past 2 days began settling into memory. Pope submitted to arrest with dignity intact, his love for his dying wife transforming what might have been mere criminality into something approaching tragic nobility. Sir Ralph stepped forward with characteristic directness as the prisoner was prepared for departure. "Quarles," he said firmly, "your man's family will want for nothing during this ordeal. See to it." The jeweller, his own reputation salvaged by his assistant's confession, nodded gratefully. "And Montfort," Sir Ralph continued, turning to Basil with gruff kindness, "that arrangement we discussed stands. The loan against your London property will be sufficient for Lady Aurelia's Swiss treatment. No more cards, mind you." Basil looked up with astonishment overtaking his earlier misery. "You mean—" "I had not yet told anyone. Claire, how did you—" Claire was already at his side, her relief bright as any jewel. "I told Monsieur Poirot you had found another way," she said softly. "I knew you would never steal from Aunt Aurelia, no matter how desperate your circumstances." As Pope was led away, his departure marked by dignity despite the circumstances, the house seemed to exhale, as if the pressure that had squeezed it tight had at last been eased. The man who had attempted one of the most audacious thefts in recent memory maintained his composure even in defeat, his love for his wife lending nobility to his downfall. Later, as the winter afternoon light began to fade and Poirot prepared for his departure, he stood before the now restored display case with obvious satisfaction. The crimson Christmas star blazed in its rightful place, the mechanical lock secure and the wax seal bearing Lady Aurelia's authentic crest, a reminder that even the most sophisticated deceptions ultimately fell before methodical investigation. "The little grey cells," he murmured to me as we gathered our belongings. "They arrange all facts in their proper order. The impossible crime reveals itself as elaborate theatre, the desperate criminal as one driven by love rather than greed. Human nature, mon ami, provides both the greatest mysteries and their ultimate solutions." Lady Aurelia approached with quiet gratitude, extending her hand with characteristic grace. "Monsieur Poirot, your reputation for unraveling impossible mysteries has been thoroughly justified. Though the truth brings pain, it also brings justice and, ultimately, peace." "It is my privilege to serve truth, Lady Aurelia," Poirot replied with a courteous bow. "And now, if you will permit, the Order of London calls to me. The chaos of the countryside, it is charming for a brief visit, but it is not home." As our automobile crunched through the snow-covered drive, leaving Starling Hall to recover from its Christmas ordeal, I reflected on how even the most brilliant deceptions ultimately crumbled before Hercule Poirot's relentless logic. The case of the Crimson Christmas Star had reached its conclusion, another triumph for methodical investigation over criminal ingenuity. The star had fallen from grace but was now restored to its rightful place, while justice, like truth itself, had emerged triumphant from the shadows of deception and misdirection that had so cunningly concealed it. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the English countryside in pristine white, as if nature herself sought to cover the traces of human folly with the promise of redemption.